Hi, welcome everybody. It's wonderful that you all came to hear our great hero, Dan Schorr.
Thank you very much. Accustomed as I am to public speaking, I still get stopped a little bit when Carla says our hero, because I lived a life in which heroics played a very minor part, I must say. I wish I knew how to respond properly to something like that. If I had Henry Kissinger here, he would know what to say. I say this because when Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize, which I don't have yet, when Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a gigantic reception for him at the State Department. And at the reception, a woman of about middle age walked up to him and took his hand in her two hands and said, "Mr. Secretary, I simply wanted to thank you for saving the world." And he looked back at her very kindly and said, "You're welcome." I haven't saved the world, nor any very large part of it. I have, however, spent a lifetime trying to make the world meaningful in some way. I've had a series of careers in newspaper work, the Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and then in radio with CBS, and then in television with CBS, and then television with Ted Turner and CNN. And then eventually I got to a point in about 1985, left CNN, was getting to a point where I didn't want to chase around for stories anymore. I was pretty good at chasing stories. I mean, as a kid when I grew up, the first story I ever got, which I tell about in one of my other books, the first time I ever had a feeling of what I was going to do in life came when living in the Bronx with my widowed mother and my brother, lived in a ground floor flat, hot day, no air conditioning, windows open. And as I was sitting reading, I heard a big plop outside. I went and looked out, and there, lying there in front of me, was a man dead who had jumped or fallen from the roof or from some window I didn't know. I saw that, and there immediately popped into my mind something I had read in the local newspaper which I used to have to deliver, the Bronx Home News. They offered $5 for original news stories. And so called the police, waited for the police to find out what they could find out, called into the Bronx Home News, and made my first $5 in journalism at the age of 12. Now, looking back on that, however, what I found very interesting was, had I really done that? A man was lying dead. I had never seen a dead body before. And there was a man lying dead, and all I could think to do was to collect the facts and call the newspaper. That certainly seemed to indicate that I had that sufficient removal from emotions of situation to be able to be a journalist. And so I got to be a journalist. I had a lot of fun being a journalist when I was young. A lot of fun. Lots of things. I'll tell you, last week would have been the 95th birthday of my old friend Richard Nixon, which brought to mind my relationship with Richard Nixon. I was working for CBS, and I was reporting things that I later found out Nixon didn't like very much. And one of the things he didn't like very much is that when the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not help parochial schools, the very politically minded Nixon went and made a speech to a Catholic audience in New York and said, no matter what the Supreme Court says, I can assure you we will find money for parochial schools. Next day at CBS, my job was, hey, find out what Nixon's going to do and give us a little short minute and a half, 2 minutes on that. And so I called people I knew at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, even called the the man who was in charge of lobbying for the Catholic school movement, and say, "What's Nixon going to do for you people?" He said, "What do you mean?" He said in his speech to the Knights of Columbus that he's going to provide money for parochial schools no matter what the Supreme Court says. What do you think of that? And this guy said, "Mr. Schorr, if it were not for my turned collar, I would say that's bullshit." And so I gave a version of that as a commentary, and as I later learned, when it all began to tumble out much later, as I later learned, Nixon got very incensed, and he called in his chief of staff, Haldeman, and said, "Listen, call Edgar Hoover. Let's get something on this son of a bitch." And so Haldeman called Hoover. All of this I found out much later. Called and said, "The boss would like to have some background on a CBS correspondent named Dan Schorr." "Oh, yes? Okay, right, we'll do that." What Haldeman had not realized is that the word background has a very special meaning in the FBI. Background is a background check, which you perform when somebody's being nominated for a White House position. And before doing that, the FBI has to do a background check. And so Hoover said they want a background check on Daniel Schorr, so okay. And they sent out FBI agents all over the country to see my brother, to see my boss, and eventually FBI agent ended up at a door at CBS and asked to see me. And he said, took out a pad, and he said, "So where did you go to school?" I said, "What do you mean? What is all this?" He said, "Well, sir, certainly you must know. This is the check we perform when somebody is in line for appointment to a position of trust and confidence in the government." I said, "You're saying that I'm in line for a job from the Nixon administration?" "Well, yes, sir, I believe so." "Well, yes, I don't believe so, and I would like to know what the job is before I do the interview." You say so. Went back, reported. Mr. Schorr said he doesn't know about a job, and declines to cooperate with our background check. Called the White House and said, "Mr. Schorr is not cooperating with our background check." "He's what? What did you do?" "Well, you asked us to do a background check. We interviewed various people, and we had to interview him. And he said he doesn't have a job." "You told him that?" Oh, for Christ's sake. And so they got together and had the crisis management in the White House. It's going to get into the newspapers, no doubt about it. What do we say when it gets into the papers? Chuck Colson's there, and Ron Ziegler, all of the little group of people talk about it, and finally Colson says, "It's crazy though it sounds, I think the only thing we can do is to say that we were considering him for a job, but we forgot to tell him before the background check began." And they, "Come on." "Well, I don't know what else we can do," so they did that. And so Ron Ziegler went out, made a statement to the press, and said, "Look, funny things happen here. We had this job we wanted to give to Schorr, and we started a background, and the president has now ordered that no more background checks on anybody before they are informed and agreed to have a background check." Yeah. But not many people believed it, and when the time came for impeachment of Richard Nixon, that became one of the things that they asked about. Haldeman and others had to testify what was this FBI thing, and they had to admit that the FBI thing was not to do anything nice to Mr. Schorr, but maybe to do something not nice to Mr. Schorr, aside from auditing his taxes and a few other things. Report was written by the House Judiciary Committee. A bill of impeachment was drawn up. Article 2 of 3 articles of the bill of impeachment was abuse of presidential power. Item 2 under that, unwarranted investigation of a CBS correspondent. And there was I, a moment in history, in the bill of impeachment. Well, eventually Nixon resigned, as you know, as people old enough to know. Nixon resigned and moved out and went and wrote a lot of books, and he did what I call running for ex-president. 20 years later, I'm invited to a dinner where Nixon is going to speak, the Carnegie Endowment. When the dinner is over, I could not resist finding out whether he still remembered me and who I was. So I went up to him and said, "Mr. Nixon, could I'm Mr. Schorr." And he put his hand on my shoulder. "Of course," he says, "Dan Schorr. Glad to see you. Damn near hired you once." Well, so I mean, that was the kind of things that I had fun doing. You're on a Nixon enemies list. I don't know what Nixon enemies list. Isn't that nice? A Nixon enemies list as number 17, Daniel Schorr. Number 18 is Paul Newman. Really not bad, huh? I've had a lot of fun as a reporter, which I did most of my professional life. But there comes a time when scoops, you've had your little scoops, and now is the time to think in other terms. And without thinking very much about it, I said, you know, all this professional life that I've had has been devoted to getting stories, to finding out what they don't want to tell you, to penetrate the secrecy, top secrecy, and all the rest of it, and find out something. Not as much as Cy Hirsch does, but something. And tell the people, because your duty is to tell people what they need to know and what somebody up there is not letting you know. And that becomes a big challenge for all of us reporters. And, you know, didn't do badly at it, you know. Was able, you know, for example, at one point to break the story that the CIA had been involved in 10 years of assassination conspiracies, trying to assassinate Fidel Castro and various others, forcing an investigation by a Senate committee, and eventually, not bad. And I'm not, you know, not sorry, ashamed. I wear as a mark of pride that I was the boy reporter who ran around trying to get stories and scoops. But then, in 1985, my contract with CNN, I had worked for CBS for about 23 years, then left on not good terms with Mr. Paley, went to work with Ted Turner. After 5 years, left on not very good terms with Ted Turner. And then I said, no, I think I want a different kind of career now. And it was at that point, by some serendipity, that Bob Siegel of NPR calls me and says, "You've done occasionally commentaries for us. How would you like to have a steady job doing not stories, but commenting on stories?" And I said, "Appeals to me. At my age, I don't run around very fast anymore. I love imparting something to people out there. And I want to do it in a different way." And that was it. And so I was taken on by NPR with the understanding that while I would be called Senior News Analyst, and as Senior News Analyst, I would watch and listen to and read all that was happening and sit down and think about it and maybe make a few phone calls to somebody who might be able to explain it. And I found that the most important thing in my life was the search for meaning. I became aware that in this age, Americans are deluged with information. If it isn't radio, it's not television. If not radio, and more now, it's the internet, where you can plug in and punch in and find out just what you need to know. Don't have to read a lot of other things. Or you can get the New York Times, a front page, or whatever. And people are deluged with information. And what they need is not information, but understanding. What does it all mean? And I decided then that that is what I would try to do. And, you know, with some success, you know, with them all, I've given accounts of things which didn't quite work out. Some things did work out. I will let you question me about some of these things, because when I do things, I look out over this sea of wonderful faces, is that I think I would rather, as Hillary Clinton might say, listen to the voices of the people. And let me continue from here by responding to you. So, what would you like to know?
The mic is in the middle of the room. We would like you to make your way, but because you're stuck over here, if you want to come up and use this mic, you're welcome. We're recording this. I know a lot of people will want to have a recording of this evening, and so we want all the questions to be heard. I mean, yeah, this young man's going to go first, and then you.
First of all, Mr. Schorr, I'd like to thank you for coming very much.
My pleasure.
It's great for all of us to see you here. My question is just that we've all watched how media has been sensationalized and corporatized in the last few decades, and quality, in-depth investigative reporting seems to have taken a hit towards the light of opinionated, more sensational kind of coverage. My question to you is, instead of just blaming corporations, what can ordinary people do about this?
The answer comes out at NPR. No. It is true. Something, you know, journalism is something which I've worshipped, not always wisely, but well. I've gotten into trouble being a journalist. So I love journalism. I adore it, and would like to think of it as being on a high road all the time. The fact of the matter is, it is true, as you suggested, that newspapers are gobbled up by companies, and companies gobbled up, and what Bill Paley's great CBS is now only a part of Viacom, and ABC now is Disney and all, and they are looking at the bottom line and not necessarily willing to devote 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks that it takes to develop an investigative story. Investigative stories are to news media much more expensive than going out and putting a camera on a place where somebody got killed in a car, or where a girl was kidnapped, or whatever it is. Those are cheap stories, and they appeal to a certain number of people. The stories that you need mostly are expensive stories, because they have to be investigated. And less are our news media willing to do it. They're all worried. Newspapers are wondering how long there will be newspapers, as they see circulation beginning to dip. Television, radio stations are, for the most part, looking for commercials and the most inexpensive kind of news. And it's right. We need investigative reporters. A friend of mine out in the West Coast, Herb Sandler, who's a billionaire, he owned a bank that he sold, is putting it into establishing an investigative reporting unit called ProPublica. And they will undertake to investigate stories on their own and then turn them over to a newspaper or a television station. Kind of funny that you have to be outsourcing your investigative reporting, but at this point, anything is better than no investigative reporting. It was really a really wise comment, a wise question to ask, because it is true that journalism today is not as free-swinging as it used to be. But while we're alive, we'll do our best.
Go ahead. use the mic.
Mr. Schorr, since you've seen a lot of Democratic primaries in your day,
Yes.
I was wondering, and you talked about the search for meaning. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the meaning of the present Democratic primary.
If only I knew. No, you're right. There's something quite astonishing is happening. It used to be called an election, primary elections, as a. What it is now is a great spectator sport, in which, in order to hold your audience, you have to get somebody to yell at somebody, the way they do on radio on certain stations, or on talk shows. If their voice is on an even keel, that's a failure. If you get people yelling at each other and saying, you're another, and not only that, but I don't like what you did, so on and so forth, then you're making things right. And this has become a very sad display of democracy in our country, because people are forced to play this game of setting up arguments between people who normally could have a very good argument just talking, but no, it's being done for radio and for television. And the series of debates, I have a feeling in my bones that somewhere where by the time we get to the point where we have to nominate somebody, that finally the candidate's going to say, I'm glad I won, but I'm too tired to do it. Goodbye.
Yes, you can.
Mr. Schorr, a lot of people have, in retrospect, criticized the press coverage leading up to the current war in Iraq.
Yes.
Saying that it was not as critical as it should have been. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that was?
Not critical. It's not. I don't think for news reporters the job is to be critical. The job is to find out what's true.
Right.
And there were enough indications for over a period of 3 or 4 years that Bush had basically decided that he was going to invade Iraq, whether because they had threatened to assassinate his father or something that I do not know. Whether to have a good hold on Iraqi oil, I do not know. But that was in the cards with a group of neoconservatives in the White House feeding stuff to Nixon. I wish.
I bet you never thought you'd say that.
And there was enough evidence of it. But the press tended to be taken in. And now I have to say something not nice about a woman I otherwise would admire named Judy Miller, and who went to jail for 400-odd days rather than reveal a source, for which I commend her. For which I cannot commend her and a series of other journalists and how they fell for what really was a conspiracy to indicate to Americans that we were in terrible trouble in Iraq, and we were not. And the job is not to criticize, the job is to expose. Others will criticize.
You're a great reader of American politics, and I'm just wondering if what I believe is something that you also note. The last time I worked on a presidential campaign was for RFK, and the only candidate that's inspired me as much as he has is Barack Obama. I just came back from South Carolina, and I've seen other people write about it, commentators, and I wonder if you feel the same way.
Carefully.
Or what you think of his candidacy? Or the
Well, no. Let me say the Democrats are oversupplied with good candidates, as against Republicans who are undersupplied. If you ask me purely personally, of the 3 now leading candidates, I could be comfortable with any one of them. Your question is more directly, what do I think of Obama? It is very clear that he's an inspirational leader. I keep thinking about it because I keep thinking about Hillary Clinton, whom I admire a great deal. And how do I balance my admiration for Hillary Clinton with my admiration, with this being a little starstruck with Obama? The answer to it is we really need, in a sense, if we could have a composite of the two of them, it would be really wonderful. We need somebody who can inspire and somebody who can manage.
She can be vice president.
We need somebody, and clearly Hillary would be a #1 great manager. She'd walk in, she knows where things are in the Oval Office, she knows whom to call, so on and so forth. And then you get this guy who's a great uniter. And he really sounds like a great uniter. As you get closer to the states like South Carolina, where there are a very large contingent of black voters, there's a little more of the old civil rights thing, but never mind. We cannot wrap all that America needs into one person. We would need at least two. And whichever the two you choose, I commend you.
While I was waiting in line, I saw this book that I thought it might amuse you. Born in the Bronx. And alas, it doesn't have your picture on it. But
Oh my God.
before I
You're
ask
going to take that off the shelf, right?
before I ask my question, I wanted to bring you regards from fellow alumni from DeWitt Clinton High School.
Yes.
My question comes back to this issue.
Are you the fellow alumnus?
I am a fellow alumnus, yes.
About 50 years apart?
Well, apart anyway.
Class of 33, what was yours?
Mine was 57. In fact, last May we celebrated our 50th anniversary with a reunion at DeWitt Clinton High School. And I might add, I don't want to get carried away with DeWitt Clinton. We could talk offline about that. But the school looks great.
Glad to hear it. Can I just tell you my one little DeWitt Clinton anecdote? I went to DeWitt Clinton during the Depression. I graduated in '33. Went during the, and I still remember, I'll never forget, down at Jerome Avenue, there's a delicatessen, and I don't know if it's still there, a Jewish delicatessen. Isn't there?
There are no Jewish delicatessens left on Jerome.
Right. And there was a sign in the window that read, "Eat here or we both starve." So, go ahead.
One more thing about DeWitt Clinton I have to share with all of this audience. I had the honor of having dinner one time with Mr. Schorr. He may not remember it. And it came out that we were both graduates of DeWitt Clinton. Everybody in DeWitt Clinton knows the first stanza of the school song. But Daniel Schorr is the only one I've ever met who knows the second stanza. I won't push you on that.
Thank you.
But anyway, finally my question. I'd like to come back to the question about the ongoing debate in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Last night, I was really, really impressed by how nasty they got towards each other.
Yes.
And I was wondering if, in your history, have you ever seen such nastiness between contenders for either party nomination?
No, I can hardly even recall previous primary debates. I recall election debates, but I can't even fix my mind on how this used to be in the primaries. It seems to be kind of a new phenomenon to spend month after month forcing these people to debate time and time again. It gets to be a rather strange phenomenon. And so I can see them waking up in the morning and say, "Where are we debating today? What did you find out about him that I can use?" Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here and being in our lives. My question
Thank
is...
Carla.
Thank you. My question is that when you look at the first article that I read, and it was in the New York Times, and it was David Brooks that said, "Run, Obama, run." And that was followed by Charles Krauthammer.
Yes.
And that was followed by the Post 2 weeks ago said that in conservative radio, there's a tremendous outpouring of support. And I was wondering, is this sort of an insidious sort of Karl Rovian way of helping to split the Democratic Party in two, in opposing camps to get the Republican in, because Democrats have a lovely way of fighting each other, and we might come down to the end with so bruised that a Republican might be able to scoot in.
I'm not sure how to answer that. The one thing I can say is I don't predict much about elections because it's so easy to be wrong, but I must say that looked at as of today, no matter whom the Republicans nominate, no matter whom the Democrats nominate, the Democrats win. I believe that because I believe that under the surface of these big debates among the candidates, what's going on is a realignment in American politics of the kind that happens every 20 or 24 years or so. And if you look carefully at the polls by Pew Research and various other, which do some very good polling, you'll find steadily people who identify themselves Republicans are diminishing. People who identify themselves as independents are now on a much larger group of people. People calling themselves Democrats are a little bit more. And I really think, just as there was a shift with Reagan, the whole country shifted somehow to the right, I think there's a big glacial shift going on back to a Democratic administration. I can't cheer because I'm a journalist.
Thank you. I was speaking metaphorically, Mr. Schorr. I was wondering what you perceive to be worse: the detached youth who can't get by without his iPod, or the NPR podcast I can listen to on my iPod.
Yeah, you forced me to make a big confession. I don't understand about iPods. I don't understand about internet. I need help sending email. I mean, somewhere I'm a case of arrested developments. But even my wife, when we really need something that has to be done about a computer, we call one of our two children who take care of it on the telephone. But that is this whole cyberspace world is a world I never made, and I would be only cheating you if I were to pretend to be able to answer your question. I can't.
Mr. Schorr, I hope you'll humor me with a slightly impolite question. I heard you say to either Bob Edwards or I think it was Diane Rehm that the editors were kind in their selection of pieces and made you look wise in what you had in your commentary. Would you mind sharing the case that perhaps in retrospect you wish that you hadn't come out and said publicly?
Yes. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which of the terrible things I did you're referring to, but on the Diane Rehm show, tell me again what was that we were talking about?
Oh no, you said that the editors, in selecting which pieces would go into the book, selected pieces that you were right about.
Oh.
So I was wondering if you would share a piece maybe that you were wrong about and wish that you hadn't written originally.
When it came to doing this book, let me first tell you that the book was not my idea. While I'm not a very modest person, it never occurred to me that there would be a lot of interest in the commentaries I had done over a period of 15 and 20 years. But it was, the Viking came and offered me a book, and I said, sure, why not? And then what we proceeded to do was to get a big pile of all my commentaries. It's a big pile going back to about 1990 or so. And then my wonderful assistant, Janaea Williams, went through all of those and packed them up and got them to the publisher. They then, between them, decided what was going to be in and what was going to be out. I do not, to this day, know exactly what was left out. You might, if you talk to Janaea, I think it's here somewhere tonight, she might say, oh, you as a publisher. You will understand if I said to the publisher, I'll give these all to you. I guess you can't use them all. No, we'll make a selection. All right. When you make a selection, hey, can you be a little kindly about the ones where I was wrong? But I decided not to find out if there were any such. So let me just say here, I never was wrong.
Thank you for all you've done. You mentioned before growing up in the Depression, and we hear now about the subprime debacle and balance of payments deficits and the stock market going down. Any commentary about the current situation as it relates maybe to the Great Depression, and where do you think this all is coming out?
Oh no, you want me not only to predict who the next president is, but also give you an economic prediction of how much the market's going to go down, whether we're in just a little trouble or a big recession. You want me to...
5 or 10% points.
I don't know if C-SPAN can edit this out, but I will tell you this and hope it will be edited out. I haven't the foggiest idea.
Mr. Schorr, again, thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to invite you to look backwards now. If you were an investigative journalist the day after the 2004 election, what story would you have pursued?
Oh, I think the opposite story, the story of how we were taken into a war we didn't have to fight. It's going to cost $1 trillion and to deprive the country and generations to come of what this country needs. I think that has to be gone into a great and very great length. I think also we're beginning to develop a pattern of the administration and it goes, I think, with the neoconservatives, and it is everything has to be a big secret. And so they tried to dismiss a bunch of U.S. attorneys because they were not good enough Republicans. Now they're keeping a big secret of how that got around. They're one issue after another. The Secret Service, which is supposed to keep a log of everybody who goes into the president's office and everybody who goes into the vice president's office. And that's an open thing. Anybody can know that. No longer. The logs of who goes to see the president, who goes to see the vice president, are now secret. If you read a headline every day, you'll find out that what happened to this email. Oh, about 1 million things were
yes.
Completely burned up and whatever. And then they stopped keeping records of it. Why? Because somebody might find out what we're doing, even 20 years from now. We need a searching look at this administration and its penchant for secrecy that has done us not very good. I mean, people have said you got to be careful because there might be national security involved in some of these things, and I'd say that this country has suffered a lot more from non-disclosure than from any disclosure.
Follow up. Is there a story yet to be told about the Florida election in 2004? In 2000.
I would propose a big examination of the Supreme Court. In one of my commentaries, which I did see in my book, I did a commentary on a day when the Supreme Court ruled, and I coined a phrase. I spoke of the Gang of Five in the Supreme Court. I've not been invited to lunch.
Mr. Schorr, this is a real treat for all of us.
And for me.
Thank you. I met you in the 70s when I was a young professor at Duke University, and it was a program put together on the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And Professor Mel Nimmer, who is known as a distinguished scholar of the First Amendment, in commenting in this seminar room, said something about we need to get the line clear of what violates the First Amendment and what doesn't. And you responded that as a journalist, you just assume the First Amendment lines stay a bit fuzzy. Do you still...
I'm sorry, what's the end of that?
You just assume that the line of the First Amendment stay a little fuzzy.
Yes.
Could you expand on that, and whether
Yes.
you still think that way today?
I'll tell you, if you go try to examine it the way lawyers do and the way people in government do, you come at the end to this point. There are certain cases where it's very important to know who the source was. It may be involved in a prosecution or a court suit. And it's been brought home to me in many arguments I've had over the First Amendment and protection of sources, which I think is what we're talking about. It's been often brought home to me to say, all right, you claim the First Amendment, we claim the amendment which provides for a fair trial. And if you're holding information, the release of which to us would mean a fair trial, you got to do it. Supreme Court said that too, that whatever you may say about protection of sources, it falls when the needs of justice are involved. I would like to be able to say no, but I can't. There are conflicting values. So all I can say is, I have a source, I will not reveal it. You claim you need it for a legitimate purpose, that's your problem. Except that they have a way of making it my problem. So I don't know how many are you old enough to remember that in 1975, working for CBS, the Senate and House Intelligence Committees were conducting investigations of the CIA. And the House Committee completed a report, was getting ready to publish it, when the Ford White House and the CIA managed to manipulate the House into voting to suppress that report. I, however, had a draft copy of the report, which I had gotten, don't ask where. And I got in front of the cameras on CBS and said, and in this report, which you're refusing to reveal, so it's a story about, and I gave several of the stories, and then eventually somebody called me and said, what are you doing with the text of the report? I said, I don't know what's to do. Don't you think that as a matter of history, you owe it to make that available? And I was convinced became convinced that was true. And so I asked CBS, which owned the publishing house, to publish a little book with this report. Their lawyers told them they might be sent to jail for treason if they did that, and they said no. I tried various others, and eventually offered the report to any organ that would print the whole thing. And that came to be the Village Voice. No, not my first pick, but all right. I gave the Village Voice, and they published a supplement the following Saturday with the full text of this 133-page report. A lot of people got mad. The CIA got mad, President Ford got mad, and CBS got mad because they were having trouble with their affiliates who didn't like being called traitors. And they started an investigation of it, which at first at one point they considered calling me before the will of the House and demanding to know where I got the report on pain of being summarily cited for contempt of Congress and sent to jail. In the end, they decided to let the House Ethics Committee conduct the investigation. And they did. And they questioned everybody, every member of the House Intelligence Committee, every staff member and so on, and finally subpoenaed me. And in September 1955, I was subpoenaed to appear before the House Ethics Committee in open session. Went up the stairs on a rainy day with my lawyer, Joe Califano, great lawyer representing me. On the way up, he stopped and said, "Gee, Dan, isn't this the wrong picture?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Isn't it supposed to be the Italian gangster and the Jewish lawyer?" I went and testified. They said, Chairman said, "Where did you get the report? What was the source?" "I can't tell you. First Amendment." "Never mind First Amendment. We are conducting a legitimate congressional inquiry. We need to know where you got the report." "Can't tell you." Third time, Mr. Schorr must advise you that if you continue to refuse to reveal your source, you can be cited for contempt of Congress, which could mean a 2-year jail sentence and a $100,000 fine. Gulp. I can't do it. Because if I were to reveal a source I promised to protect, I would be denying sources to next generations of journalists. And so I can't. And they ended the hearing, went into executive session, came out and announced that they reprimanded me. There was a big reprimand, and on the subject of a contempt citation, the vote was 6-5 not to cite me for contempt. I'm telling you all of this because every one of these stories where somebody needs to know a source and you can't reveal a source involves very painful things. It may even involve a case for example, the Supreme Court ruled in a case that involved an investigation, the prosecution of the Black Panthers. And the Supreme Court said, it's a prosecution, you got to do it. But they didn't. They went to jail. So if I gave you the impression that it's a muddy thing, it is muddy. We fight for our First Amendment. They fight for whatever they have to fight for. And sometimes we meet at the middle, and sometimes not. And sometimes Judy Miller goes to jail.
Mr. Schorr, I have admired you for absolutely years. You're just marvelous. You have to live forever.
I'm working on it.
This country needs wise people. I remember when Carter was president, and I liked him. And one of the news commentators said that a failed presidency happens when you tell the Americans that they cannot have more. I've never forgotten that. And since there is really going to be hell to pay for what this administration has done to us financially, and since you said that a Democrat is likely to win, and I'm terrified of that because we, the Democrats, are going to be responsible for the, quote, taxes that are going to be required to pay for what has been done to us. Mm-hmm. How are we going to survive this as a party? Because we will be blamed, Americans, for some reason love our country and hate paying for it. And if that's the case, and we have a one-term president, which I would love to have as Obama, whether it's Hillary or Edwards, I want a Democrat. How do we survive this? What do we have to do to convince the public that, yeah, we do have to pay for this?
Well, luckily, I won't be around to see it all. But the answer to your question is difficult, and it's an interesting question and very difficult. And it is, after Hoover had helped to bring this country into a depression, President Roosevelt came in and worked on it and lifted us out. We have tremendous resiliency and tremendous background resources if they were just unleashed by the right people. If you can assume that we will have a Democratic administration, I think they'll start very fast working on it. And always in the past, we've gone through bad presidents, bad administrations, and bad conditions, only to bounce back, because that ability to bounce back is what makes America. So I offer you that small encouragement.
I figure whoever becomes president, Republican or Democrat, many of those secrets that have been held in this current administration, they're going to be desperate to let them out because they're going to want to blame Bush for everything. And that's the only way they're going to be able to come in with a clean slate. So the question is, who do you think is the next Bush person who's going to end up in jail?
You're not satisfied with Scooter Libby?
No.
You want...
Although I think the name is really cute. I would like to see a different.
Right.
And I think there's a pecking order. I don't know how far it'll go, but...
You can't convict a president in office, you can only impeach him. And while there are small signs some Democrats would like to start an impeachment procedure, the facts are that starting from 1 year before the end of his term, it is not likely that an impeachment procedure, if you actually got it underway, would even be finished by then. And so it's an idle and useless thing. Will people go to jail? White House people very seldom do, except for Nixon's case. I don't know what to tell you. We deal with life as life is. We take over from a ruined, failed administration and try to rebuild. And on the whole, we don't look back. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming and sharing this beautiful evening. It's a tribute to Dan, what he stood for in journalism, and in his commentaries, the scrupulousness of his work, the dignity that he's imbued, and the hope that he gives us all that when we're in our 90s, we can be as alert, as humorous, as charming as you can are. Fantastic. Hi, welcome everybody. It's wonderful that you all came to hear our great hero, Dan Schorr.
Thank you very much. Accustomed as I am to public speaking, I still get stopped a little bit when Carla says our hero, because I lived a life in which heroics played a very minor part, I must say. I wish I knew how to respond properly to something like that. If I had Henry Kissinger here, he would know what to say. I say this because when Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize, which I don't have yet, when Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a gigantic reception for him at the State Department. And at the reception, a woman of about middle age walked up to him and took his hand in her two hands and said, "Mr. Secretary, I simply wanted to thank you for saving the world." And he looked back at her very kindly and said, "You're welcome." I haven't saved the world, nor any very large part of it. I have, however, spent a lifetime trying to make the world meaningful in some way. I've had a series of careers in newspaper work, the Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and then in radio with CBS, and then in television with CBS, and then television with Ted Turner and CNN. And then eventually I got to a point in about 1985, left CNN, was getting to a point where I didn't want to chase around for stories anymore. I I was working for CBS, and I was reporting things that I later found out Nixon didn't like very much. And one of the things he didn't like very much is that when the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not help parochial schools, the very politically minded Nixon went and made a speech to a Catholic audience in New York and said, no matter what the Supreme Court says, I can assure you we will find money for parochial schools. Next day at CBS, my job was, hey, find out what Nixon's going to do and give us a little short minute and a half, 2 minutes on that. And so I called people I knew at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, even called the man who was in charge of lobbying for the Catholic school movement, and say, what's Nixon going to do for you people? He said, what do you mean? He said in his speech to the Knights of Columbus that he's going to provide money for parochial schools no matter what. All the police, waited for the police to find out what they could find out, called into the Bronx Home News, and made my first $5 in journalism at the age of 12. Now, looking back on that, however, what I found very interesting was, had I really done that? A man was lying dead. I had never seen a dead body before. And there was the man lying dead, and all I could think to do was to collect the facts and call the newspaper. That certainly seemed to indicate that I had that sufficient removal from emotions of situation to be able to be a journalist. And so I got to be a journalist. I had a lot of fun being a journalist when I was young. A lot of fun. Lots of things. I'll tell you, last week would have been the 95th birthday of my old friend Richard Nixon, which brought to mind my relationship with Richard Nixon. Pretty good at chasing stories. I mean, as a kid when I grew up, the first story I ever got, which I tell about in one of my other books, the first time I ever had a feeling of what I was going to do in life came when living in the Bronx with my widowed mother and my brother. Lived in a ground floor flat, hot day, no air conditioning, windows open, and as I was sitting reading, I heard a big plop outside. I went and looked out, and lying there in front of me was a man dead who had jumped or fallen from the roof or from some window I didn't know. I saw that, and there immediately popped into my mind something I had read in the local newspaper which I used to have to deliver, the Bronx Home News. They offered $5 for original news stories. And so